The Creaking House. I always thought the scariest things happened when you were alone, until the night I learned that being home alone isn't always a blessing. I'm not prone to exaggeration, but if you don't believe me, well, every word is true. It started on an ordinary autumn evening. I'd been working late at the hardware store and trudged home under a sky smeared with bruised purples and greys. The wind was picking up, and the sound of rustling leaves against the pavement sent an uneasy shiver up my spine. I'd been living alone in a small, creaking house on the edge of town for over a year, and while I'd grown accustomed to its quirks, squeaking floorboards, groaning pipes, something felt off that night. The first hint came as I fumbled with my keys at the front door. My hand brushed against something cold and wet on the knob. I pulled my hand back, convinced it was just condensation. But when I stepped inside, I noticed a faint, musty odour, like damp earth mixed with decaying wood, that I'd never smelled before. The hallway light was out. I'm usually careful about changing bulbs, so I knew something was amiss. I switched on every lamp I could find. As I wandered from room to room, my footsteps seemed unusually loud on the worn carpet. In the living room, the silence pressed against me like a physical weight. I told myself that my mind was simply overreacting after a long, exhausting day. But then I heard it, a slow, deliberate creak from upstairs. It sounded like footsteps. I froze. My first thought was that maybe I'd left something on that floor, causing a noise as I moved. But then, from the far end of the hall, came another sound, a soft thud, as if someone had stepped on the stairs. I stood rooted in place, heart pounding, convinced that I wasn't truly alone. I mustered the courage to climb the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The upper landing was shrouded in darkness, and the only light came from the weak glow of my phone's flashlight. I swept the beam around and saw nothing, but a chill crawled up my neck as if invisible eyes were tracking my every move. I hurried back downstairs and locked every door, double-checking the windows. In the silence of the now bolted house, the ticking of the old clock on the wall sounded unnaturally loud. Every tick echoed like a countdown. I tried to focus on rational thoughts. Perhaps it was just the wind or an animal that had found its way in. But deep inside, I knew something was wrong. A few minutes later, as I sat in the kitchen trying to calm my racing heart with a cup of weak tea, I heard a whisper. It was so soft I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my imagination. The sound came from the direction of the upstairs hallway. I told myself that stress was playing tricks on me. After all, I'd seen enough horror movies to know that a creaking house was just an old house. But then the whisper came again, this time clearly spoken, my name, drawn out in a low, guttural tone. I slammed my mug down, splashing tea onto the counter. The sound made my skin crawl. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps I had heard a radio playing from somewhere, or it was the wind manipulating the loose window shutters. Yet every instinct screamed that I was not alone. I decided to check the security cameras I'd installed after a break-in a couple of years ago. I flipped through the recordings on my laptop, static, dark halls, my own nervous movements captured in jittery, grainy frames. Then, on one clip, I saw something that froze me in terror. At around 11:47 p.m., a dark figure was visible on the landing, its head tilted as if listening. There was no reflection in the mirror behind it, and it vanished as soon as I approached the door. I rewound the clip several times. I knew I had left it all locked up when I left for work that day. Who could have gotten in? That's when I heard a louder noise, a heavy thump from the basement. I wasn't a superstitious person, but I had a nagging memory of unexplained sounds coming from that room when I was a child. The basement was a cramped, cluttered space filled with old furniture and boxes I'd been too lazy to sort through. Grabbing a flashlight and a baseball bat for comfort, I made my way down the narrow, creaky stairs. At the bottom, the basement looked exactly as it always had. Damp walls, the faint hum of the old furnace, and scattered belongings. But then I noticed a door at the back that I'd always assumed led to a storage closet. The door was slightly ajar. My pulse thundered as I pushed it open. Inside was pitch black, and the air was heavy with the scent of mould and decay. I fumbled for the light switch. It didn't work. Instead, I switched on my flashlight and swept the beam across the room. The beam caught on a cluster of old photographs scattered on the floor. I bent to pick them up and froze. The photos showed me, taken over the past few months, but in every image there was something odd. In the background of each shot, a dark silhouette lurked, just out of focus. In one, it was standing in the doorway. In another, it was behind me. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Were these taken by someone else? Or was my mind betraying me in a desperate attempt to rationalize the inexplicable? A sense of dread pulsed through my veins. I left the closet with trembling hands, back up the stairs, back into the living room, and into the relative safety of the locked front door. I called my best friend, Dan, who always said I had an overactive imagination. His voice, usually steady and reassuring, was uncharacteristically quiet. "You sure you're all right?" he asked. I hesitated before blurting out everything, the noises, the whisper, the camera clip, the photos in the basement. Dan told me to check the local news for any reports of break-ins or strange incidents, but there was nothing. In a final attempt to calm me, he said, "Maybe you're just tired. Sleep on it. Tomorrow everything will seem normal." The house seemed to breathe with me, each creak and groan echoing my own fear. Invisible eyes felt like they were watching, unseen hands reaching out. The terror was palpable, a living entity that thrived on my fear. I was no longer alone in my own home. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound made me jump. Every creak of the house felt like a prelude to something worse. I sat in my living room with the lights on, listening to the storm outside battering the windows. The rain sounded almost like distant whispers, the wind like hushed voices. I scribbled notes frantically in a battered notebook, trying to capture every detail, every sensation, as if writing it down could somehow make it real or make it go away. Around 2 a.m. I heard the front door creak open again. I didn't move, barely dared to breathe. A slow, deliberate scrape of footsteps echoed through the hall. My heart hammered as I tiptoed towards the kitchen, where the faint sound of something dragging along the floor met my ears. The sensation was almost physical, a heavy presence, as though someone were inching through the room. I tried to catch a glimpse in the dark, but only shadows greeted me. In a moment of irrational bravery, I whispered, "Who's there?" The response was a pause, a long silence, then a quiet, raspy laugh that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. My rational mind shattered. I ran to the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway outside was empty, its dim light flickering as if the power itself was dying. I retreated to my room, barricading the door with a chair. I could hear soft tapping on the window from the side of the house, a rhythmic, almost insistent tapping. It sounded like fingernails drumming on glass. I pressed my back to the wall, trying to steady my breathing, while my mind raced with dark possibilities. Was it a trick of the wind, a stray branch? No, the sound was deliberate, measured. The next morning, the storm had passed. Sunlight filtered weakly through the grime on the windows. I forced myself to inspect the house, hoping to find some rational explanation for the night's terrors. I found muddy footprints leading from the back door to the staircase. They were small, almost childlike, and I didn't have any children. I remembered clearly that I had double-locked all the doors when I left for work. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it as a prank, but the evidence was right there. I contacted the police. They arrived, examined the footprints, searched the premises, and left with nothing more than a recommendation to install more security cameras. I was left with the lingering feeling that something in that house had been watching, waiting, and that it might still be there. Days passed, and I tried to resume a normal routine. But every night the terror returned. At exactly 11:47 p.m. I began hearing the footsteps on the landing again. I'd lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of dread crushing every thought. I even started sleeping with a small flashlight by my bedside and kept the kitchen door chained. Then one night, I woke to a soft scratching sound at the window. I mustered enough courage to approach it. There, on the cold glass of the living room window, were words scratched out in what looked like dirt. "I see you." I ran to the bathroom, splashed ice-cold water on my face, and tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew it was no trick. Desperate for answers, I began scouring online forums and local news archives. I found several old posts on Arno's Leap about unexplained occurrences in houses like mine, stories of shadowy figures, inexplicable noises and disembodied whispers. Some claimed that the spirit of a former resident, long forgotten and filled with unresolved anger, roamed their homes. Others suggested that certain houses become doorways to something beyond our reality. I tried to laugh it off, but every word I read made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I even reached out to a local paranormal investigator, a quiet man named Elijah who rarely spoke of his work. He visited on a rainy afternoon, carrying a worn leather case full of old instruments. He moved slowly through the house, his eyes constantly scanning the corners as if expecting something to leap out. When he reached the basement closet, he stopped. "There's an energy here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Something isn't meant to be seen." He left abruptly afterward, leaving me with more questions than answers. The doorway to terror. One night, as the clock neared midnight, I sat in my living room trying to force myself to sleep, reading a battered journal I'd kept since childhood. A sudden, deep knock at the front door startled me. It was a slow, deliberate knock, as if someone were testing the wood. I froze, dread coiling inside me. Who could be there at this hour? I looked through the peephole. It was dark outside and no one was visible. I hesitated before opening the door, my hand trembling on the knob. Outside on the doorstep lay a single envelope. I picked it up with gloved hands. There was no return address, only my name scrawled in spidery handwriting. Inside was a single photograph, a black and white snapshot of my living room taken from an angle I knew I'd never have access to. In the photo, in the far corner of the room, stood a figure A pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes seemed to stare directly at the camera, and the figure's hand pointed at something behind me. I flipped the photograph over. In small, handwritten letters it read, "You can't hide from what lives here." You can't hide from what lives here. I never did figure out who or what left that envelope. I hung it on the wall, a macabre reminder that something was intruding into my life. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every creak, every whisper of the wind through the trees outside sounded like the footsteps of that thing from the photograph. I tried one final desperate plan. I arranged to spend one night away at a friend's cabin in the woods. I thought if I left, even for a single night, I might break whatever curse had taken hold of my home. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by dense pines, and shrouded in a silence that was almost too complete. For a while everything was normal, quiet, peaceful, and utterly mundane. But in the dead of night, I awoke to the sound of tapping on the window, much like the tapping I had heard at home. When I looked out, I saw nothing but impenetrable darkness and swaying trees. I tried to convince myself it was only the wind, but then I noticed the temperature in the room dropping sharply. My breath became visible, and a fog seemed to roll in from nowhere. I felt a pressure on my chest, as if an unseen hand was pressing me down, and I knew with bone-deep certainty that I was not safe anywhere. I returned home the next morning, defeated and trembling. The house was just as it had been, yet everything felt tainted with a malign presence that I could neither shake nor ignore. I've tried everything since, sealing windows, adding alarms, even calling in a priest. Nothing has stopped the strange occurrences. Now, every night, as darkness falls and the clock ticks inexorably toward 11:47 p.m., I huddle in my room, clutching a worn blanket and listening to the house's creaks and groans as if they were the beating of a heart. I no longer sleep. I simply wait for the inevitable. I don't know if I'll ever be free of the feeling that something malevolent watches me from the shadows, or if my home will forever be a doorway to an unknown terror. I'm writing this now because I need someone to know what I've experienced, because I'm tired of explaining it away as stress or fatigue. I know how this sounds, but every word is true. And if you ever find yourself home alone on a stormy night with only the silence for company, remember, sometimes the scariest things are the ones that hide in the darkness, waiting for you to notice.